Laws were passed specifically directed against the Chinese. They were harassed and massacred. Their word was not accepted in court. They could not own land. They could not marry non-Chinese. They were restricted to Chinatowns. And in 1882, in direct contravention of a bilateral treaty between China and the United States, they were absolutely excluded from the United States.
I want to talk about a problem in the United States, which is anti-Asian prejudice and violence, which has obviously been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, but has a much longer history in the United States. In this video, I want to take a look back on why that is, how this happened, and why it's still relevant today. So let's go back. Enter the California Gold Rush.
It all started in 1849, shortly after California was won from Mexico. A man working on a sawmill picked up some rocks in the water. And soon the word was out. There was gold in California.
In the late 1840s, thousands of Americans decided to just pack it all up and head west to California, hoping to make a quick fortune. News of this gold rush spread quickly across the United States, but it also caught the attention of Chinese immigrants who hoped to take advantage of a booming industry and provide for their families in the newly minted California territory. By the mid-1850s, California's Chinese population had grown to tens of thousands and didn't seem to be letting up. San Francisco was a popular port of arrival for these early Chinese immigrants, and naturally the first Chinatown was established there, and remains the largest Chinese community outside of Asia to this day. However, the prospects of mining for gold weren't made equal for everyone, as Chinese miners would soon come to find out. The state began levying a series of punitive taxes on foreign miners, particularly Chinese miners, as ethnic and racial discrimination continued to swell. Eventually, though, the gold rush came to a halt, and many Chinese workers moved on to other pursuits, such as railroad construction. And this is where things start to take a turn for the worse. Fast forward to the late 1800s, and railway construction was reaching nearly every corner of the United States, and with it, Chinese workers willing to be paid paltry wages to build them. To the eyes of white Americans, Chinese laborers carried the reputation for providing cheap, menial, and often backbreaking labor. And this became a problem for them. White Americans ended up being outcompeted for jobs, and this led to violent altercations for years to come. In fact, anti-Chinese sentiment became so rampant that in 1885 Tacoma, Washington, the Chinese community of around 700 people were forcefully compelled to leave by orders of the city mayor, and the few hundred that refused were eventually forced onto a train to Portland by an angry mob that eventually pillaged and burned the entire Chinese community to the ground. This would become known as the Tacoma Method. Yeah, probably not a good thing that the city I grew up in was known for its forced exile of ethnic populations. These forced exclusions of Chinese communities would continue to happen across the West Coast and eventually reach a breaking point in 1885 and 1887, when lynch mobs attacked and killed at least 28 Chinese miners in Rock Springs, Wyoming, and 34 miners in Hells Canyon, Idaho, which today remains the most lethal act of racially motivated violence against Chinese people in the United States. These events were undoubtedly emboldened by the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which outright prohibited immigration or return of Chinese immigrants to the United States. While thousands of Chinese immigrants still managed to slip in through porous points of entry, the Exclusion Act would formally remain as legislation for 61 years until 1943. And speaking of the 1940s, the most infamous anti-Asian policy that the United States ever adopted, of course, was the Japanese internment during World War II.
Here is the motion picture record released by the United States Navy of the havoc wrought by the Japs' sneak sky and sea raid on Pearl Harbor, America's mid-Pacific naval bastion.
Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, around 120,000 Japanese Americans were rounded up and shipped off to internment camps across the country. I mean, let's be real, they were concentration camps. Most of them would never see their homes, property, or jobs again and generally had to start over from scratch. Reparations wouldn't be made for decades, which hardly accounted for the trauma and loss that many thousands of Japanese Americans unduly faced during the 3-year internment. George Takei authored a graphic memoir, They Call Us Enemy, which I highly recommend if you want to get more insight on like the lived experience of Japanese Americans during the internment camps. So that brings us to today, 2021. And well,
a wave of violence against elderly Asian Americans, putting communities across the country on edge.
The NYPD reporting a nearly 2,000% increase in Asian American hate crimes last year.
The truth is, the United States is completely different today than it was during the gold rush of the 1850s. But it also isn't.
Kung flu, yeah. Chinese virus.
The China plague.
China's going to pay a big price what they've done to the world. This was China's fault. And just remember that.
The United States and perhaps many countries in the world still have a long way to go in order to curb anti-Asian prejudice and violence. But we must continue to advocate and support them as these things have not changed.